It's no secret that in August of 2016, when No Man's Sky released to the public, it was a bit of a disappointment, to say the least, for just about everyone involved. It was sort of the big joke of the gaming scene for the entire year and is often still cited as kind of the example of how not to launch your game. At the time, it was such a laughingstock that there was even a large, sort of frequently updated, by the way, Reddit post that was a list of all of the promised features that the game did not have. And it seemed that every week or two there was another news article about Hello Games or about No Man's Sky in some way that was just sort of another bit of fuel to add to the fire for pretty much the rest of the year, actually. It was not a good launch. It was pretty much an unmitigated disaster, and it was sort of spectacular in how hard it could flop, because a lot of people were very excited for No Man's Sky, and who could blame them because it had a ton of hype surrounding it at the time, and you can argue whether or not the hype was justified, but that argument's kind of passed long ago, and we're left with the reality that the game did not launch in a very good state. From missing features to very, very poor performance, crashes, corruptions of saves, to just being kind of ugly and not looking like it was supposed to look, that sort of very colorful, almost Spore-esque appearance that it sort of had in the pre-release footage, and of course, bringing up Spore when we're talking about launch disasters is another thing, but never mind. To even things like very, very heavily advertised features like multiplayer being sort of vapor, just not existing at all by the time the game came out, and only after the game was out and had taken a lot of people's money did the reality surface that this was something that wasn't even in the game. However, and here's where it gets sort of interesting, Hello Games did not actually stop development of No Man's Sky despite this very, very large setback, we'll call it. And in a very interesting case in the gaming scene, we saw a team working diligently after the game had come out in this unacceptable state, trying to get it back towards what people actually expected in the first place. And it was not an instant thing, and in fact, for a long time, people thought the game was abandoned, because social medias from the developers, blog posts and things like that, they were all basically completely silent on the subject of the game entirely, and no one even knew that there was going to be any sort of update on the game at all. It was just sort of one of those things that happens unfortunately often in the gaming industry, where something launches, is a total flop, and is then immediately abandoned to never be heard from again. But that's actually not what happened. A while later, even through all of this, the nonsense that had surrounded the game for so long, Hello Games actually offered an update, a free update to the game called the Foundations Update that brought it more in line with what people had actually expected. It did not fix everything, and it didn't add back the things that had actually been missing, but it was a very large, very unexpected step in the right direction. And that's kind of what I want to talk about here now. What is No Man's Sky actually like 3 years later? Well, almost 3 years later. It's not August yet, but you get what I mean. And the basic concept is sometimes developers don't abandon their games if they flop. And you often see that more in the indie scene, where, you know, their reputation and consumer goodwill is basically a necessary currency required for them to actually survive as a company. But in the AAA scene, or at least, even though this is kind of an indie game-ish, it was also, you know, very heavily involved with Sony and also cost a lot of money on launch, $60 in fact, like a normal AAA game would, so it doesn't really fit the indie bill per se, and often games in that space, well, if they launch in a bad state, they kind of stay that way. They may receive some updates, but they will often be kind of small updates in comparison, and most of the grievances that customers actually have with the product will not actually be addressed. Perhaps in a sequel, but of course that implies that you're willing to buy a sequel of a game that you were disappointed with, which is another argument entirely. But in this case, No Man's Sky did actually receive a lot of updates, and in fact is going to be receiving yet another one soon-ish at the recording time of this video. Sometime in the summer, there's going to be another large update to the game that adds a bunch of things, including VR support to pretty much everything, which should be really, really interesting indeed. Because by now, the game has actually become something worth playing. It still costs too much, in my opinion. $60 is a bit much. I mean, it's a large game, yes, but that's kind of a lot, 3 years later. However, oftentimes for the celebration of these large updates, the game actually goes on sale, and in fact, when I got a hold of it in celebration of the updates coming soon, it was actually 50% off, a pretty steep discount, which I feel was very much worth it. So what actually is the state of the game now? Well, one of the biggest problems that a lot of people had at first was the performance and the just overall stability of the game, which was quite low in both cases. That is no longer the case. The game actually does perform very well now, and I haven't personally had any crashing issues, and I haven't really heard of any crashing issues in a while, because most of that was actually sort of battered down a while back. And it used to not perform very well for really a variety of reasons, but now it actually does hold up quite nicely. It also looks different. In the original pre-release footage, as I mentioned, it had a very colorful aesthetic. It was almost Spore-like, with the creatures almost look like they're made out of some sort of biological clay, kind of like how Spore does it. And the colors were very saturated, and everything was just colorful and nice in general, even on the sort of darker planets. But when the game came out, that actually wasn't really what it looked like, and some of that was simply due to a post-processing sort of overlay-like effect on the screen, that if you removed it, would actually show that the game underneath looked better than it seemed to, which made people wonder why that effect was even there in the first place, which is a great question. I have no idea. I mean, there's stylizing the UI is one thing, but there's stylizing it so much that it actually makes the game look worse underneath. That's a completely different thing entirely. And that's basically what was happening here. And updates since then have significantly toned down those effects, and have also just put the game closer to what it was originally intended to look like, with a nicer, more user-friendly user interface, and just more saturated colors and things in general. Now, the game does unfortunately still have a bit of a scanline effect and a vignette around the edges of the screen, meaning it has those sort of blue lines as if you're looking through a helmet, so I get the concept there, but I think it's a bit obnoxious. And a vignette is when the edges have a sort of fading to black darkened effect around the edges, which I think looks great in a lot of screenshots, but is not very good in terms of live gameplay, because it tends to make the field of view seem even more constrained than it actually is. So I turn those off. Now, unfortunately, the game does not have the ability to turn those off right now, which I think is a bit of a misstep. There isn't anything in the options menu that will disable those. You have to download a mod. Luckily, the mod is absolutely tiny and works with the game just fine and doesn't affect the performance or anything. But just something to mention there. And also, the game's draw distance has been improved over what it originally was, but is still not great. Even for a 2016 game, the sort of LOD and draw distance that happens, really more the LOD pop-in, is more significant than I feel that it should be. Now, some of this may be down to the procedural nature of everything, and of course how fast you can go in things like your starship, but still, it seems a bit much to me. Now, all those things being said, there was also one really, really big feature that, of course, caused huge consternation within the launch community, and that was multiplayer. The game was sort of, I won't say promised, but it was hinted at having a multiplayer element, and pretty much all but confirmed to have one before it launched, and of course, famously, it did not have one at all. Now there is actually a multiplayer mode, so you can play co-op with friends and actually go to the same planets together and see each other at the same time and do things together and explore the stars with one another, which is cool. And in fact, there is a sort of multiple types of multiplayer. You can have the sort of you just randomly come across someone type of multiplayer, that sort of ambient multiplayer, which is sort of what was intended to be in the game originally, and you can also have an actual lobby-based join your friends multiplayer session, which is great that that's actually there. So yeah, it took a while, but that feature is actually in the game now. Surprise, surprise. One of the other big things was the base building aspects and things that people were sort of looking forward to or expecting that were completely absent, and they have added several features in that genre of things that, making your own mark on the universe kind of thing, that actually are genuinely pretty cool. So you can build bases now, and in fact you can build bases with friends if you want to, and you will have a sort of small assortment of things to start with to actually build a base, but as you get more and more blueprints and find more technology and things like that, you can eventually build larger bases out of more materials, and you can color everything and get weird glitches in reality to decorate your base with, and it's actually pretty cool. The base building is fun, and you can, in fact, claim and build multiple bases on multiple different planets and moons, and teleport between them once you get the ability to build teleportation gates, which actually doesn't take that long. And you can even teleport from your base to one of the orbital stations, the outposts up in space, and to and from those between your bases. It allows you to sort of travel between systems quickly using these teleport gates that actually don't use warp fuel, so you can kind of still be exploring like a long distance away from one of your bases while being able to get back there quickly without having to do a bunch of warp jumps and waste a bunch of fuel, basically. It's a nice system, and it's a very good way to do base building. It's very modular. It feels like building a base in really a lot of first-person games that allow you to do things like that with the sort of snapping system, where each of the pieces actually sort of snaps together. I also like the color system that allows you to color all of the base building parts and even the decoration pieces and things. It's nice. I really appreciate the system in general, and in fact there are lots of mods that even add more to it than that. There's also a freighter system now that allows you to basically have the same sort of base building idea, but in space. You can actually get freighters, large capital ships now, buy them, or, and as was the case for me, get them as a reward for saving them from a bunch of pirates, which is kind of cool, to be honest. And yeah, you can have a base up in space as well, and you can have bases on planets, moons, and in space all at the same time, and individually the game will track them all. So anything that is placed within all of them is actually, permanently there, basically. Which is nice. The actual freighter mechanics do go more in depth than just having a freighter. You can dock your ships in it, you can get resources to build more rooms into it that add more functionality to it, and even customize the interior. You can have the captain and other ships, like say a science vessel or like an exploration vessel and things like that, that you can send on expeditions for you. Really, it's actually a fleshed out mechanic, and to the point that the game is actually starting to remind me mechanically of like a 3D Starbound, to be honest with how it works. The base building and sort of space freighter kind of situation is very Starbound-esque, and but in 3D, and it does a good job. It's a really good mechanic that actually should have been there in the first place, probably, but I can't not appreciate it now that it is there. And there are also just general things now that just simply add to the variety and the interest of the game, things that probably should have been in there again in the first place, but have now been added to simply increase the explorability, the variety, just the interest in general that the game should have had. Things like surface vehicles, so you can make rovers and upgrade them separately from your ship and things like that. Things like more varied structures and life and things like that on planets and different types of planets to make them, and just exploration in general, more interesting. And even stuff like underwater mechanics. You can dive underwater now, you can find specific things underwater that you can't find elsewhere, and even things like sunken ruins and underwater labs and the like, and you can even build stuff like that. It's pretty cool. You can even have a submersible vehicle, an underwater submarine with a reactor and everything like that to use in larger planets that have a lot of water on them. So overall, the game has come a long way in its 3-year time since release, and has also really just become more pleasing in general. A lot of people have actually started to rate the game positively. A lot of people have started to enjoy the game and are being more open about playing in larger groups and things like that with their friends, because it's no longer something that you would subject someone to because you don't like them. It's something that you would actually play for fun. And I have to respect Hello Games for actually sticking with it. Now, of course, you can also say, and very accurately, that the game should not have come out in that state, and to be honest, I don't know the truth of how the development went. I don't know how crunched they were. I don't know how constrained they were during development with Sony, eyeing them and things like that. I have no idea how all that went, so I'm not going to speculate on any of that, but still, it's safe to say, as a consumer, the game should not have come out asking for money in the state that it did, and was a pretty big negative mark on the developers as a whole. But now that it has been fixed up a lot, it is definitely something worth playing if you enjoy games of this nature. And let's be clear, it is still No Man's Sky. If you don't like the gameplay loop of, setting down on a new planet, scanning things, building a base, mining for resources, upgrading yourself, that sort of gameplay loop that the game offers, that's still what it offers, and you still aren't going to enjoy it if that was one of your biggest problems with it at the time. It offers it in a more advanced and a more varied way than it did before, that actually performs properly, but it still offers the same sort of thing, just better. So if that doesn't interest you, it still won't. But I do feel that it has actually come a long way, and it's sort of one of those rarer stories in gaming that is actually, it's worth telling because of the fact that you don't often see something launch in such a bad state actually get better in any meaningful way, and even have more updates continuing 3 years on to the point where people are, willing to pay money for it now. It's an interesting story that I think should be broadcast to show what goodwill actually does for you in the games industry and why you shouldn't squander it, basically, because situations like this don't happen often. Now, it is not a perfect game, obviously, still. There are some problems. There are some sort of port-related issues with the controls and the way that the mouse and keyboard actually operate. Sometimes it just performs kind of strangely, and it almost seems like it's meant to be used with a controller. And some other issues like that, although they did add a third-person and first-person switch for being on foot and in your ship, which is nice. And there are a couple of problems, like I mentioned earlier, with like the vignette on the edges of the screen and the field of view and things like that you may need some mods to actually fix to your preferred specs, I guess you could say. But still, it leaves it in a much better state than it was before, and although it is still a flawed game, it is a flawed game actually worth playing if this style of thing interests you, and it does me. It's kind of like Minecraft in that sort of chill exploration and slow crafting and improvement kind of a simulator, although I'm sure there's a better name for that, and it does a good job now. It's an interesting story. So there you go, that is No Man's Sky 3 years later, and we'll see what the updates continue to bring for this game with its virtual reality update. I'm hoping that cockpit that they showed for the land vehicles actually comes in non-virtual reality flavor as well. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.